What's up, my miners of intelligence and consciousness? I'm Rick Brooks, and this is Rick's Mind. Today with me, I have guest Ford Fischer, one of the founders of News2Share and friend of the show. What's going on, Ford? Welcome back to the show, brother.
Hey, thank you for having me back on.
Man, there is so much going on in the world, and I want to start I want to get right into it. I want to get your thoughts on what you think about Elon Musk taking over Twitter, and then also some of the Twitter files that have just dropped. The first part's kind of an opinion. I'm pretty pro. I think it's great. I think, Twitter right now is a wild, wild west. You've got Eli Lilly, people making fake Eli Lilly accounts saying insulin's free. I think it's great, right? It's the comedic value of it is impressive. It's back. But I also can see that there's some cons to this, and you're a very avid user of Twitter, so it'd be interesting to get kind of your take of the Elon situation, and then in turn the Twitter files.
For sure. So I think that it is probably that Elon's effect on Twitter is probably more complicated than one can turn into this like really strictly partisan, like Elon bad or Elon good. Like, I think that that's been part of the issue so far, is that like the mainstream media, and I guess what I would call like the American center left, or like the establishment left, have been very quick to try to make Elon into kind of a monster. And on the other hand, I think that there has been this on the American right, this instinct to turn him into kind of like the new messiah sent to save Twitter from all of its downfalls. And I think the reality is we're talking about there was a big tech CEO and now there's a new one. And Elon is probably more public facing and ideologically driven than most CEOs. And so that has driven Twitter into some interesting directions. And so it's been a lot of change very quickly. And so I actually have, I think I would say, like rather mixed feelings about that. And so I do want to be clear that in my journalism, I try to be not so much of an opinion journalist, right? My work is primarily about going to situations and just documenting them, making, footage the style of primary source documentary footage is basically just filming something and showing the audience what happened and hoping that my own thoughts or opinions are essentially irrelevant or excluded from it. With that being said, my method of delivery of that kind of content is very much wrapped in free speech type issues, right? I have to be able to publish it, without the state interfering, for sure. And then also, through means provided by these technology organizations. And so it puts me in this complicated position of being a journalist who tries to exclude my opinions, but then I do have opinions on, on the best ways for those corporations to be able to facilitate that delivery of information. It affects me as a party. So with that in mind, and bearing in mind that opinions are opinions, and so I'm not reporting my ideas about Elon as fact, I will firstly say that I think that the biggest change it seems like he's made is the idea of verification as something you can acquire by paying for it. I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, it took me a really long time to get verified. And that process was, and to be clear, that was pre-Elon. That process was rather arbitrary. And it still happens, I would say, very inequitably. And sort of what I mean by that is mainstream news networks tend to sort of facilitate the acquisition of check marks by the people who work for them. So without naming names, like there's a small news network in DC, which is around where I live and primarily cover. And their newsroom, when their main news account got verified, all of the people who worked there and had email addresses associated with that news company, they were all verified at the same time. Even people who were quite new, even interns, right? Like just everybody was all verified at once. And with it in mind that theoretically the check mark was supposed to be a sign of authenticity and journalists were essentially supposed to get those, and it's not a sign of this person is important or special or something, it should essentially be equitable. But the danger that it fell into was that it was excluding people who were not associated with corporate media. This new idea of people being able to pay for it, on the one hand it was cool because it takes some of the like status symbol out of it, which I think is good, that it's not this sort of like elite holier than thou because I have a blue check mark versus the rest. It's like, or you could just pay $8 a month and you'd have it. I think that leveling of the playing field in a way is a good thing. But I also think that it's really bad that people were able to be verified when they were not actually the thing that they were saying they were. Like if somebody is making Nintendo and they just have a 3 instead of the E, and it looks like a verified Nintendo page, then the term verification is meaningless because they haven't actually been verified as anything. And I think that can be responsible for disinformation. Just to give like a really specific example, I've seen one that's an account that looks the same as Ben Shapiro's account, and they did that same thing, like a 3 instead of an E. And because people were doing this, Elon was saying, okay, well, now you'll get banned for impersonation if you don't mark parody if it's an impersonation account. So this Ben Shapiro account, which as we're recording this, I believe still exists, is verified, looks like the Ben Shapiro account, and they have it as Ben Shapiro author of, and then so it says like author of this is a parody account, so that the name is too long to render most of the time. And so even though it technically follows the rules by saying parody, you don't see parody when you're scrolling, and it just looks like Ben Shapiro posting something that he's not. And so I do think that's ripe for fraud. So I don't want to monopolize all the time of speaking here, so I'll kind of throw it back to you. But like that would be the first thing Elon did, and as you can see, I have pretty mixed feelings about that.
And yeah, I definitely think that's fair. You know, for whatever reason, for good or for bad, like I like the chaos. Like it is funny to see these people, like, you know, if you didn't know who Ben Shapiro is, he's a conservative thinker. I think he runs or owns the Daily Wire. Very Orthodox Jewish person, and I don't know if this is the specific account, but on the other one, like he's in a gay relationship with someone, and he's just saying all sorts of wild things, which obviously if you know who he is, you know that that's bullshit, but if you don't, you'd be very confused. I find most of these things to be hilarious, and it makes me think like the artistic or the comedians of the world who have these ideas. I want to talk to them because I don't know how you have the time to like think up these funny things. But I can see, you know, from your perspective, that is very problematic when you have a lot of people that do go to Twitter for the news. Because in my opinion, and I believe yours as well, Twitter is like the tip of the spear. Like if something crazy goes down, the first place that you're going to be able to get boots on the ground, or, you know, your eyes in the digital space of getting information of what's going on, is going to be Twitter. Everything else trickles. Maybe Reddit if you're lucky and you're on the front page and something's going down, but I think Twitter's going to be generally the best site for that. So it's confusing. But on the other hand, I think that this chaos is going to get cleaned up. Everyone's acting like what's going on is terrible. But what's happening is change. And it's one administration or one management situation transitioning into another. So there's going to be a lot of chaos, and there's going to be a lot of bad ideas. But overall, I feel like Elon taking over this company and purchasing it is probably the best thing. Like I think it's a good thing, especially, which will lead us into our next point, is the Twitter files. Right? Like what, and if you could, I'm not sure that everyone is caught up on what's going on, but if you could and just kind of succinctly let the audience know what the Twitter files are.
Right. So we are recording this on December 9th. And so I want to be clear that as of now, there have been sort of 2 batches of what the so-called Twitter files that have been released. And my understanding is that essentially Elon has he has generally been making the point that there were misdeeds done by the former runners of Twitter. And in order to expose what he sees as those misdeeds, he has shared some degree of files or access to a handful of reporters to sift through and report on. And so the first batch was released by Matt Taibbi and the second by Barry Wise. And so in that first batch, from reading through it, it was a number of documents mostly pertaining to Twitter's grappling with the suppression of the story of Hunter Biden's laptop in October of 2020. And so what the interesting thing about, I guess, both of these releases is that neither of them really showed something that the public didn't know had happened. What they really did was add color to the way that Twitter was dialoguing internally about these as they were occurring. And so in that first one, the public-facing reason that Twitter took an enforcement action, which was, to those who don't know, the New York Post had a story about this laptop. Twitter suppressed the link such that the New York Post itself as an account was suspended until they would agree to delete the story. Ultimately, Twitter undid that so that New York Post wouldn't have to press delete on their own story, thus acknowledging some kind of misdeed. But if someone else shared the link, it would tell you that it's an unsafe link, and it would prevent or make it more difficult to send or tweet and so forth. And what they used as a justification for this was that the materials being reported on were potentially hacked. And so they have a policy against the sharing of hacked materials. And so, like, in more practical terms, if I somehow managed to get into Rick's, computer, I found some kind of document of his that I wanted to expose him over, and then I published that on my own Twitter, that would be against Twitter's rules. Twitter essentially alleged that they felt that this story violated that rule. And what the first round of document releases showed was that internally they were not actually sure about that. Indeed, our current understanding of that situation was that Hunter Biden left his laptop at a repair shop, not that it was illegally hacked by some foreign party. And so internally they were saying, this appears to be a genuine story, and also it probably doesn't violate that policy, so we're going to face criticism, which they of course did. It was talked about in Congress and so forth. I actually thought that the most interesting part of those releases was that Congressman Ro Khanna, who is a Democrat, actually was concerned and contacted Twitter himself, not about the proliferation of the story, but he was concerned about the suppression of journalism. So for all of this discussion of like, the right wing cares about free speech and the left doesn't or whatever, it was actually a Democratic member of Congress who actually tangibly took steps when this happened to contact Twitter and seek clarification about that. The second round of documents, which came out last night as we're recording this, which I personally find more substantial, sort of shows the back-end tools that Twitter used to suppress, or as people have used the term, shadow ban content. And so shadow banning, to those who don't know, is sort of this idea which until yesterday was not quite as tangibly understood, and it's still a little hard to define. But basically an enforcement action that is not confirmed by the moderating company, but suppresses somebody's content. So as opposed to you weren't allowed to post this, and so you're being penalized for it, in the case of like outright banning a piece of content or a person, or something like YouTube where they might age restrict your content to make it less available, but they tell you that they're doing that. The idea of shadow banning is that they're suppressing your content but not telling you that they're doing that. And ways that can happen include marking your account as sensitive, making it harder to show up algorithmically, preventing it from showing up in search suggestion bans, and so forth. This has actually affected me. My coverage of January 6th, I've personally filmed the violence at January 6th. My footage was used in the impeachment of Trump. But over the 5 months following January 6th, my entire account was actually marked the way that pornography is. It was marked like this profile may be sensitive. You would have to have your settings on Twitter to allow 18 plus stuff to be visible, and then even if you did that, you'd have to press buttons individually to view any of my tweets, and it wouldn't show up in search suggestion bans. In other words, my content wouldn't be visible unless you specifically went out, sought it out, and then said, I'm okay with seeing porn, and then you'd be able to see my video news coverage of January 6th and so forth. So Twitter never acknowledged that, and they never actually told me this is an enforcement action because we thought your footage was too violent or whatever they thought the problem was. It just happened, and then one day it just went away. In these files that have been released, we now see the back end of it where they actually have buttons for search suggestion ban, for marking a profile not safe for work, and so forth. Not allowing someone to show up in trending was another one. So they had actually very specific penalties that they could impose on accounts that are unappealable and not communicated to the person. My criticism of the release, however, I will say, so I think it's good that the public can see that. I think it's good that we're aware of that. And Elon actually himself said that people would now be informed when that kind of action is taken and have an ability to appeal. Unequivocally, I think that's a good thing. Adding more due process, I think, is always positive. More transparency is always positive. The problem I have with the releases so far is that the actual examples given appeared to be just photos taken of a computer screen of specific profiles who these actions were taken on. It was like Charlie Kirk, who's like a conservative commentator, for lack of a better word. Dan Bongino, who's like a Trump kind of loyalist. Libs of TikTok, which is an account that primarily targets LGBT people by posting what they see as absurd or offensive or whatever things that those people post. All of these were accounts generally associated with the right wing, and I think that it probably falsely left people with the impression that these things only happen to conservatives.
Yeah, I think that's a bit of a problem too, because there's definitely got to be people that are on the left that this happened to as well. I think that primarily, I don't know, but there's definitely got to be. So I think that's a good point.
It's an international service. I mean, the other thing is that there's not just the conventional American left or right. Like Palestinians wouldn't be like left or right in the conventional American sense, but there has certainly been suppression of content related to Palestinian struggle. Very recently, like since Elon, Garland Nixon, who's a progressive radio host who was on the board of the ACLU, was banned from Twitter for a post critical of the State Department's support for Ukrainians. I mean, so politics are just more complicated than left and right. Yes. And I am concerned about leaving the public with the false impression that it only affects one particular American political ideology when the issue is so much more complex than that.
100%. There was also it's a leftist gun rights organization called the John Brown Gun Club.
Yep.
They do a lot of counter protesting at LGBT events that are targeted by people like Patriot Front and the Proud Boys and far right activists. That their account was banned, and there's been a lot of, I can't think of the names, but there have been several other leftist accounts banned as well.
Right. And so what was interesting about that particular chapter of the John Brown Gun Club was it seems to be in response to them doing organization of like you said, an armed counter rally. Facebook has actually taken you can kind of see the way that like all of these different, like Twitter's in the news right now, but Facebook for 2 years has basically had a policy that like any organized armed group or group that calls for people to show up to anything with guns is bannable. And so Facebook there was actually a leaked list. It was like hundreds and hundreds of organizations. Some of them, like international terrorist organizations, are looped in with as the same as like leftist groups attempting to provide security for like a bar with an LGBT event in it. Sort of as conflated as if these are all the same. In the post-Elon takeover world, I've seen conservatives to some extent cheering on when leftists get taken down. I don't actually think that that's so attributable to Elon. I think that that's been happening before. It's not like this just happened to there's just sort of this different focus of attention. But other than some account restorations post Elon, I don't think that the policies have changed so much in practice. It's also fascinating that Elon himself has said that he wants more free speech, like in terms of what you're able to publish, but that he wants to decrease attention to what he sees as negative or hateful postings, which is just an endorsement of shadow banning. So as he's canning these documents and saying, we need more transparency about shadow banning, which is nice, he's still actually endorsing the practice of shadow banning. He hasn't said that this will end.
Yeah, and I don't think it will. I just think that I feel like the other side, right, or like, I don't know, you and I are really just kind of sitting back lurking, but let's just say he's far more he's kind of endorsed republicanism, right?
Right.
The other side's like, we're fucking in control now, so like he's not necessarily going to be targeting the messages that we're trying to, he's going to, which is, I think, a legitimate concern. If you're on the opposite political aisles, they're going to be like, he's going to employ the same nasty tricks that didn't necessarily affect our ideology. He's going to flip that over to the next, which is what I don't want to see any of that happen. What I was hoping, and what I do hope, is that the water, we've got a water spigot and it's just kind of leaking. I want him to turn that bitch out and just let's see what happens, right? Like, let's see what happens. Pure, unadulterated freedom and free speech. It's probably not going to be pretty, but it'd be nice to kind of see what's going on in the world. I think that's maybe the best way to handle it, but also maybe not the best.
I think it's just challenging because there's some competing priorities. So like, it's easy for us to talk about free speech versus not free speech as it relates to like hate or things like that. But Elon's primary criticism going into Twitter was what he saw as inauthentic activity, like bots, for example. And so like being more restrictive of what you see as inauthentic, manipulative, spam, and so forth, intrinsically that also has a friction with free speech. There are plenty of bots that actually do valuable things on Twitter. Like you can take a thread and tag this like there's a thing that turns it into like one post, so it's like easy to like read it. Like that's a bot. I mean, it's literally a robot that you tweet at and it does something. Clearly, I don't think anyone, including Elon, would want that taken off. Everybody, probably including Elon, would like accounts with 0 followers that have a picture of a woman in a bikini that like messages 100 people and says like, send me money, or whatever. Like everyone agrees that that's spam and you would want it to be taken down. But there is somewhere in the middle, right? There is actually some line. Elon has said that wasn't strict enough. Eventually that also does lead in a path of problems of speech. There is going to be that person who says, my bot shouldn't have been taken down, and it was. And so I think that this issue has mostly been attached to politics, but it is not exclusively. And so Elon has walked into a more complicated minefield, perhaps, than the simplicity of his just like, I want free speech and no spam. Okay, it takes a lot of intricate design to get to that goal.
Yes, 100%, and he's going to be faced with nuance, right? Which is not something that in the businesses that he's been involved in, everything's pretty black and white, and there's going to be a lot of nuance because you're coming over from a mechanical and in some points and chemical engineering background of all the way back to his old roots of like software, but even his old roots of like PayPal, that was like banking, right? It's pretty black and white, debits, credits, and now you're going into this space where there's a shit ton of nuance, and I don't know how you tackle that, right? Other than just cranking the hose or cranking the water spigot, opening it up and just seeing what happens, which is what's I feel like, which that's being done right now, and you're taking back and maybe doing a case study of what's going on. But who knows? I certainly would want to be in that position.
He also has basically placed his fortune on the line. I mean, I think the amount of money that he would have, even if Twitter completely was ablaze and caught fire, and even if Twitter didn't exist tomorrow and he lost all of that, he'd still have an unfathomable amount of money from the perspective of any of us on this stream. But to him, like, he is, you know, his position as the most rich person on planet Earth is jeopardized if the profitability of Twitter ends up in decline. And so while he is certainly performing as though his incentive is purely ideological, I imagine that at some point the consequences of, as you put it, kind of just closing off the spigot and just letting everybody do whatever they want, there are advertisers who will certainly put pressure on him in the opposite direction. And so there is a complication of money to be added to all of this as well.
Yeah, and that's going to be tough, because I'm sure that the advertising dollars after the Eli Lilly situation and a lot of the fake corporate accounts, the rise of that, I'm sure that people are pulling dollars away from Twitter. A lot of money's exiting that company right now. So I don't know. You know, he's got his work cut out for him. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out.
I will add on the money point. One thing that he has said that he will do that I think would be immensely positive is adding monetization features for content creators. So
yes.
So right now, like, my primary like places that I publish are Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Facebook and YouTube both essentially pay me roughly half of the advertising revenue that is placed inside of videos of mine. So if you're on Facebook and there's an ad on the side of it, I don't get any money from that, even if you're looking at my stuff. But if you watch one of my videos and it plays an ad beforehand, I get part of the money from that happening. Similarly, on YouTube, they pay out 55% to the content creator. Right now, Twitter essentially has like a button that's, you know, someone could send me a tip. Like, you know, it does have the ability for a user to press one thing to see how to send me money, but it doesn't have any direct monetization feature. The fact that someone is spending more time on the website because I have posted something to it generates revenue for Twitter and not for me. He has said that that's something that he'd like to change, and I would unequivocally support that, assuming that it happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you post any of your stuff on Substack?
No. So I do have, I work with Matt Taibbi, specifically on, I make documentaries out of content that I've filmed. So like I generally publish raw footage to News2Share without any kind of narration or anything like that. There's sort of a segment that we've generated called Activism Uncensored, where I sort of consolidate my raw footage into 10-minute sort of mini documentaries where I narrate and just sort of explain placing us in time and so forth. And so that has, he then writes them up and it goes onto his Substack when I do those. So I sort of peripherally have used Substack, but I don't have one of my own.
I'm a big fan of Matt Taibbi. I really am. Big fan. So that's cool that you know him.
Yep.
So I want to kind of switch gears here. You have your pulse on activism and what's going on in the world, and I kind of want to get into some of the things you've been filming, some of the rallies that you've been at, and really just kind of see, you know, what your opinion is on the state of our society and where do you think things are heading? And that's a very broad question.
The state of the union is strong.
That's a very broad question, but I kind of want to I want to figure out where your head's at.
Sure. So I have kind of been telling whoever will listen to me that I think that right now America is in sort of, I would say, like a false or a superficial sense of peace. And what I kind of mean by that is, you know, we were in a very, very tense place in 2020 and beginning of 2021. And kind of the climax of that tension was January 6th. But that didn't happen out of nowhere, right? That happened both in the context of violence that had happened over the summer and into the fall as a response to police violence, as well as then in the fall and into the winter, the claims of election fraud. And neither of those situations actually changed. Like, the underlying causes of that violence has not actually changed, even if the violence has. And so what I mean by that is, post January 6th, right-wing activism really fell off a cliff. There was just a lot less organization. Whereas I used to see, like, in the lead up to January 6th, highly active right-wing militia groups. Hundreds of Proud Boys could be organized in Washington, D.C. or Portland for individual events. Those groups are now showing up at things much more like the dozen than by the hundreds or thousands. Yeah. Similarly, racial justice activism has not really stopped, but there have been much smaller numbers and much less attention by media when those things happen. And I think that is in part just time. Like, it's been longer since the summer of 2020. But also that, in my experience, it was way easier for them to organize when they had Trump as kind of a general kind of enemy to organize around. Like, in DC, there was kind of this joke of, like, protest is the new brunch. Like, people would look for, what protest are we going to? And that was really driven by Trumpism. Nothing has really actually changed about the underlying issues. And that's not to say that, like, that the activists didn't accomplish anything, but, like, most reforms were fairly local or individual, right? Minneapolis' city council might have changed this or that. Individual cities might have changed their police funding, whatever. But on the whole, the activism has slowed down significantly, but the underlying conditions haven't. Similarly, most Republicans today being polled, the last time I saw it, it was something like 70%, still think that the election of 2020 was stolen by Joe Biden. And so that underlying condition hasn't actually changed, even if nobody's storming any capitals right now. Therefore, I guess I would say, the conditions that led to violence in 2020 and early 2021 are still there. All of these tensions, the problems that led people into that stuff is all still there. And I think that Trump was a very animating moment where he got the right very excited and he got the left sort of excited to fight him. And his announcement recently was kind of low energy, both literally his own speaking about it and kind of the response to it. But I suspect that over the next year, and especially 2024, a lot of these tensions will probably reignite. And it is my own opinion that while the Capitol will never be stormed again, while the United States Capitol will be heavily protected, probably from now on, I think that the potential for violence at boards of election, state capitals, the potential for another tragedy related to policing to reignite that movement in that way, the ability for those two types of movements to clash again, I really think that all of that is kind of on the horizon, and we're already seeing small-scale versions of that where it has been kind of in the last few months that armed groups are starting to pop up again, both on the left and the right, sort of in confrontations with one another.
So you're saying that we're in a powder keg of emotion right now, and all we need is just the fuse to be lit, and something might explode.
I'd be careful about the word need. It might be all that it takes. But I mean, I think that the types of tensions that I'm describing. So I would look at how even though if they haven't formed into mass movements, there have been a lot of, like, I think, individual signs that, like, it's like they have all been like relatively small, but it just little things keep happening. So just examples of what I mean. Following Trump's being raided at Mar-a-Lago, I had a contributor film as there were people who showed up with guns outside the FBI office in Phoenix, Arizona. Nobody got hurt, technically legal to open carry, but nonetheless, Trump supporters showed up exercising their Second Amendment. Meanwhile, I think it was Ohio or Michigan, somewhere else, there was an individual who showed up with I think it was a nail gun, who tried to kill FBI agents, who himself had participated in January 6th before that. There's also been a huge uprise in the number of kind of impressions, accounts, whatever, talking about sort of anxieties over they're turning our kids gay or they're turning our kids trans, like this kind of anxiety. And that has led to the real world presence of people with firearms at events like that, as well as we know of, two bomb threats to hospitals that were perceived as being part of that. And then, of course, there was the shooting in Colorado Springs that I believe left, was it 5 people dead?
John, pull it up.
And a number of others injured.
It was 5 people, yeah.
As we are recording this right now, I'm going to be going to Texas in a few days because there is in San Antonio going to be, and at the time you publish this, there was, so we'll see how it goes, a situation in which there's going to be some kind of a all ages transgender celebrating holiday event, and there were
in
reports
Tejas?
that a right-wing militia is inviting people to. I shouldn't just say reports; they're organizing it on Twitter. That a right-wing group is saying, please come and open carry outside this event. Like, they're going to protect the children who are attending it by bringing firearms. And this has caused there to be, there are also left-wing groups that are saying we're going to show up armed to protect against that. But the net result is that what I am anticipating is, at best, that there will be armed adversaries facing each other outside of an event with children inside. That's probably the best case scenario for how that goes. And I think it goes without saying how essentially fundamentally dangerous that situation is for parties other than activists, right? Like for the people who are just attending inside, the possibility of a shootout or something like that outside is obviously, risky.
That's a powder keg. But how sure are we that this isn't like foreign interference? Because I can't remember the documentary, but like there was how sure are we that this isn't like Twitter being manipulated? This is one of Elon's concerns, right? By these bots or these fake organizations that might start rallies to cause internal. Like, how sure are we that that's because this just seems a little bit too good to be true, right? Like, why? I don't know. There was I can't think of the example, and John, see if you can find something on this, but in my memory, there was like a Muslim rally in Texas, and then another one was like a kind of a definitely right-leaning Christian rally, and they were set up right next to each other in the hopes that things would pop off.
It was in Texas, Texas Muslim Capital Day in January of 2017. Was organized by a Russian Facebook page.
See, but this to me, like something like this seems like it would be another state. Another state's the best word that comes to mind. My brain's, I need more coffee, but it seems like this is ripe. This type of situation seems like it'd be some interference from a foreign entity, right? Like it just seems too good to be true.
I certainly hesitate to just speculate that that's the case.
Good point.
I think it's. I guess I can neither confirm nor deny. I mean, how could I know or not whether something like that was going on in this particular situation. I will say that I looked into the group, the right-wing group that's attending, and their name escapes me right now, but they have shown up at previous events, including some in which they believed that there would be an adversary, and then there wasn't one.
Was it Patriot Front?
It was not Patriot Front. This is a local Texas militia group. But I would note, however, so like there was a situation in Ohio this past weekend in which the Proud Boys had promised to go to, there was going to be a trans friendly event inside a church, and the Proud Boys said that they would come and protest it. And the church ended up canceling this event because of the possible attendance of Proud Boys. So the Proud Boys still showed up. To be clear, I did not personally go to this. I was covering a different story in Kentucky at the time. But the Proud Boys showed up as promised. But what was, I think, probably more interesting was that it ended up sort of magnetizing other right-wing groups. So Patriot Front did show up.
Was it Texas Freedom Force?
Texas Freedom Force. I believe that's the group that we're talking about.
John.
Is the one in San Antonio. There was a local militia that showed up at this Ohio event. There was a group called White Lives Matter that showed up. And so what's interesting beyond just sort of the numbers is the kind of inadvertent coalition that's sort of formed where like the Proud Boys contend that they are race blind. They say that they're sort of not racist, but they're also kind of anti-racist. Like, they clearly sort of take a side, but at the same time, they say that they're not an organization based around race. Similarly, apparently this militia claimed that they were there to like police both sides and keep the peace.
Okay.
But whereas standing beside them, people who were attracted with apparently the same goals as the Proud Boys were White Lives Matter, which is sort of an explicitly white nationalist, organization, and Patriot Front, which is a avowed fascist group. They have their recruits read Mussolini. Like they are. It is no secret that they are fascist in alignment. And so these different groups kind of coalescing next to each other, even if they all did their own separate, kind of take on the thing, they've ended up with sort of a shared enemy. So what will be interesting to see, and again, by the time you publish this, I think it will already have happened, is to see which groups show up at the Texas thing. The Texas Freedom Force is saying, anyone who wants to bring a gun, but just please show up. We'll see what happens, right? Would that attract people like Patriot Front? Would that attract people like Proud Boys? What types of people on the left will show up to counter it? It remains to be seen, but kind of those dividing lines, the coalitions are sort of forming, and that will certainly be complicated and have implications leading into 2024.
So you're a really good person to ask.
Okay.
Patriot Front. They are a fascist organization. Now, in order to join them, do you have to be white, or like, is that like, are they like, I couldn't find, I read their manifesto, but I don't know, like, outside of them being fascist and, trying to save America, I don't really fucking know what they are.
So, okay. So I want to be very clear that they use innuendo and
Yes.
they sort of mask they mask their language by making it seem very like it's like hard to describe.
It's so hard. That's what I'm saying.
They use a lot of euphemisms to try to obscure what exactly they're about. So firstly, let me say that I interviewed their founder, Thomas Rousseau, before he had founded Patriot Front. And so this was Charlottesville. So I filmed the violence and the torch rally and stuff that happened at Charlottesville. And so Thomas Rousseau, who was only 20 years old at the time, torch in hand, said he's like called me a degenerate or something. And I went up to, and so I started recording, and this is as they're preparing for the famous torch march. He has an unlit torch in his hand as this conversation happens. And I went up to him, I started recording immediately, and I was like, did you just call me a degenerate? And he said something like, well, you're with the media, and the media is all degenerate, so it's sort of a multi-step process. And I was like, okay, whatever. Like, and I was like, so what are you doing out here? And he describes why he's at Charlottesville, and he talks about how he thinks that white people are under attack and so forth. And I asked him about, it didn't seem to me apparent that he was necessarily like a neo-Nazi or something like that.
Yeah.
And I asked him, why are you allying with with National Socialists, with Nazis. There were avowed groups there who identified as National Socialists. And he said, his exact words were, well, I'm a fascist myself, so I'm not really allying with them. I am one. Ooh. And so he did self-identify with the term fascist at the time. At the time, he was with Vanguard America, which essentially is the group that because James Alex Fields, who was since convicted of murdering Heather Hare in the car attack in Charlottesville, because of his sort of loose association with that group, they basically disbanded, and then Tommy Rousseau founded this new group. He disputes the idea that it is simply a rebrand of Vanguard America, but in any event, he went from one to the other. He founded this new organization. Patriot Front uses American patriotic imagery as opposed to things like swastikas, Klan hoods, or whatever.
Yeah.
I think in an effort to appear more palatable to conservatives. And I have sort of seen this be effective, like in the sense that, like, when I've reported on them, I do not use the word fascist sparingly. Like, some people on the left will like refer to
everyone
groups, everybody. They will say that
fucking
the Proud
drives
Boys
me insane.
Right. They'll say like the Proud Boys are fascists or something like that. Like, I understand why they might use that, but when they say that, they're using it. I don't want to say imperfectly, but like imprecisely.
Yes.
They're using it as an insult, which they're certainly entitled to do.
100%.
In the same way that a right winger might be like, "Oh, AOC is a communist," or something like that. Like, she doesn't identify as a whatever. Mm-hmm. So, in the case of Patriot Front, they don't outwardly say, we're a fascist organization or we're a white nationalist organization. Mm-hmm. Instead, when they march around, they use a flag that is basically the American flag with a fasciste on it, right? Which literally the term fascism, right, comes from this kind of idea of like a bundling, like, and which is exemplified or symbolized with a fasciste. So they literally have, it's like a bundle of sticks with an axe in the center of it. They are using or hybridizing original Italian fascist iconography and putting it onto the American flag. When you ask them about it, they will say, "Oh, well, there's actually a fasciste somewhere in the capital." Like, there are some places that it's ended up in American symbols of democracy, and so again, they can kind of like point to other examples, and they'll go, that Mussolini stuff, that's not what we're talking about," right? Similarly, on their website, for example, they talk a lot about, well, America was founded by Europeans.
Yes.
Right? They talk, and it's exclusively for its founder. Like, they kind of have this like complicated way of describing white nationalism where they avoid using that exact label. And so they've done the same thing on the street, where like when they meet people who they think are possibly favorable to them, they are obscuring their message by saying, "Oh, well, we're not white supremacists. We just have XYZ belief. We just want to like support white people, defend like some kind of victimhood thing, or we just want everybody to be, to thrive separely." Like, they come up with these various different ways of describing it that make it complicated or hard to label them.
I've been so confused because I've read the entire manifesto. I was like, well, this didn't really say anything. The one point that you brought up that I really, and this is why I love talking to you, is the last thing that I ever want to do is call someone racist or call someone like a Nazi or a fascist. And the prevalence of that word, that's the last thing. I don't want to believe that of my fellow man, right? And so when everything gets labeled that or anything I get confused and I automatically just dismiss it as truth. So I figured you'd be the best person to ask about that because you have a lot of experience in these types of situations. And until we can take a step back and like that being the last means, the last resort as calling someone that, I just have to sit back and be, well, I don't know one way or the other. I'll have to look into it. I'm confused, but yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear to me. And that's what I'd thought initially, but I really wanted to be firm on labeling them that.
So they had a big leak. They had a lot of data, like on one computer or something, that somehow was acquired by Unicorn Riot, is the name of kind of a left-leaning news organization, independent news organization. Among that, as well as documents that ProPublica published, like internally, like within their actual organizing spaces, which are not covered by the media. Tommy Rousseau referred to themselves as "we are the modern fascists." He just he just outright says it. He assigned Mussolini as reading and so forth. And so I would be careful about there's the distinction between their public facing, they put all of these like big words into a manifesto and they avoid just saying, fascist, whatever. That doesn't mean that they don't have an understanding behind closed doors of exactly what they are.
Yeah, what's up, John?
So according to the ADL, Patriot Front is a white supremacist organization whose members maintain that their ancestors conquered America and bequeathed it to them and no one else.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so that's basically like it as a multi-step process. Like if their claim is white people founded America, and then they're like, and only the founders should get it, they're white nationalists. Just with a couple of steps to get there.
What are some other groups that you're seeing? Any new types of I'm looking for the word activist groups. That's a good term. That are popping up that you're seeing recently.
I think I would hesitate to use the word new to describe what I'm about to say, but something that's been really interesting to me this year is I've actually spent a lot of time up close covering black self-defense groups.
Yeah, Black Panthers.
So that includes the new Black Panther Party,
Yep.
which is controversial in some ways, right? There are people who dislike them using the term Black Panther on the basis of lack of relationship with the original Black Panthers. There are actually groups that call themselves the original Black Panther Party, again, which some people sort of dispute the connection. But in any event, kind of modern Black Second Amendment groups. This July, I went to Mississippi, where I filmed as a coalition of these sorts of groups went to talk about a case that happened in Brookhaven, where there was an individual who was a black FedEx driver who was shot at by a father-son duo as he was delivering packages. He went down a wrong driveway.
Dude. Yeah.
And CNN did report on that. There was some reporting on that shooting when it first happened, but the media mostly kind of stopped caring about it.
Yeah.
And to be clear, they shot at him and then they chased. He drove away.
They chased
him.
Yeah.
And so they these groups came to rally around him about the fact that the two individuals were not at the time charged with any kind of hate crime. They weren't charged with attempted murder. The charges were very small. It was something like assault and conspiracy to assault for the two guys. They were able to swiftly make bail. So they were rallying to advocate that they be charged with murder over it. What was fascinating, or kind of the most interesting aspect of that day, was that they first went to a DA's office, who refused to speak with all of them. Then they went to a police station, who refused to speak with all of them. And then they actually went to the scene of the shooting. And so this young man was able to tell his story where it happened with armed protection from Panthers and so forth. Other than me, there were two journalists who were there. There was one local journalist who showed up, like a local newspaper guy, and then there was one documentary maker who I was the one who referred him to be there, like told him, hey, this thing is going on, and he showed up there. So me and a friend of mine were 2/3 of the reporters who actually cared to go to this. 2 days later, there was an armed march in Natchez, Mississippi. Before I describe this, are either of you familiar with Natchez, Mississippi, the Devil's Punch Bowl?
The name rings a bell, but I could not tell you why I know it.
Right. Okay. So this was the scene of a end of Civil War tragedy in which the Confederacy pushed formerly enslaved people to this basically canyon.
I know.
And the idea was to slow down advancing Union forces. And basically those Union forces on arrival, the history is very sort of poorly recorded. That, you know, who would document themselves doing these sorts of things, right? But the Union allegedly basically forced them all to stay there, and they starved most of them to death. And so, as some historians have said, that I believe the number was like 80,000 people essentially died, who would have been freed at the end of the Civil War, and instead the Union forces confined them to a space where they starved and died of diseases and so forth. Barely talked about in history. I will say I was not familiar with it until learning of the protests that would be taking place. And the reason that they did this event, that was actually, it began at the graveyard there, and they marched through town and then returned to that graveyard. So they were making a very specific point about the tragedy that had unfolded and the fact that history had not really recorded or talked about it. I was the only press other than like participants who had cameras, right? So there were a few people who sort of had like essentially Black Panther media, so to speak. But as far as press from outside of them, I was the only person who covered, as it was hundreds of armed African American people marching through the streets of an American city, talking about a genocide that took place, and no press showed up.
Yeah. Jesus, yeah. There was another one that happened in North Florida, but I don't remember the name. And then there's obviously the Black Wall Street, but I was not aware of that. Now I'll probably lose myself for a few days looking into this.
I found it very difficult to research in this, and I don't mean just like, that it was hard reading about it because of the sort of brutality about it. I mean, like, literally, it's hard to find information about it.
John, see if you can find anything, put it in the show notes.
So, going through the situations, there was a few weeks ago, I went back to Mississippi, to the town of Gulfport, where there was a 15-year-old who had been shot by police outside of a Family Dollar who died. And that case similarly has not attracted much media attention, although it's had daily protests. And frankly, I suspect that if it had been an election year, or if the Orange Man was president, the media might be a lot more interested. But nothing about policing changes when it's President Biden instead of President Trump, and yet, the media seem to be pretty much disinterested in that shooting. I went there and filmed as the founder of Black Lives Matter of Greater New York was carrying an AK, among other people in that kind of coalition, talking about their issues. And again, I was one of very few journalists. Most recently, this past weekend, and I think maybe most fascinatingly, there has been sort of a renewed attention to the lynching of Emmett Till in 1955. To those who don't know, Emmett Till was accused of whistling or perhaps grabbing the hand of a white woman at a store. And he was brutally taken from his home and murdered 2 nights later. And the two murderers of Emmett Till were tried at the time in 1955 for murder, and they were both acquitted. They said, "Oh yeah, we totally kidnapped him, but we let him go. We're not even sure if that's his body." That was their defense, and the jury an all-white jury acquitted them in an hour. And there was sort of a famous quote from someone on that jury that said something like, "It would have taken less than an hour if we hadn't taken the time to get a soda first."
Yeah.
It's very clear in history. It's commonly understood that the lynching of Emmett Till, it is unequivocal that those two men did that murder, and they got away with it because of a bias on the part of the jury. Those two men later admitted to it in an interview with a magazine because they couldn't be tried a second time. What was really interesting, two things happened this year that drew renewed attention to this 67-year-old case. Firstly, there was a movie made about it. So there is a film, I believe it was Oprah who actually like financed it. As I just said that, I'm not. Was it Oprah? Or was it,
John will pull it up. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, if you could look it up, there was some celebrity, there was some A-list celebrity who financed the film and was involved in it. After I just said Oprah, I'm like, I might be thinking of a different film for her. It might have been Whoopi Goldberg. In any event, there was a film, and additionally, this year, a warrant was found that in 1955, the two people who physically murdered Emmett Till had been tried and then were acquitted, therefore preventing them from being charged again. And they both died some years later. The actual woman who made that first accusation was charged, or what a grand jury charged her with kidnapping, and so an unserved warrant existed for kidnapping. And Carolyn Bryant is still alive and reportedly lives in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And so this was sort of a long introduction to get to this weekend. I filmed as a coalition, including Black Panthers, armed activists showed up in Bowling Green, Kentucky, to go outside of Carolyn Bryant's home and say, we want her to be charged still. And they were faced down by police who also showed up with rifles. And so this kind of led to this very tense sort of, in the words of Malik Shabazz, who was there, who was one of the leaders in this group, sort of a showdown as the police were staring down activists who were holding rifles. And they said, you're all here right now, but, you know, at some point, you're all going to leave, and this woman's still going to be here sort of unprotected. And so she is now 88 years old and will, in all likelihood, die without ever being held to account for it. But it was fascinating to me to see that she is still alive and see a protest about that case.
So it was Whoopi Goldberg
Yeah.
who financed that. Yeah.
Nice.
I haven't seen the film yet, but I've heard that it's very, very good.
Definitely not going to watch it. I'll get sad. It's like I started watching Fruitvale Station. I was like, fuck
Oh my
that.
God. I was miserable after watching that. I think it's a very, very, very important movie.
It is a very important movie, but I just as soon as he came home and was hanging out with his family, I was like, nah, dude, nope, you got to turn it off. I'll get sad. Can't do it.
Yeah. I will say Fruitvale Station, just as a side note, was an important film and an important story for the fact that was one of the first cases in which like civilian held footage, a cell phone video is the reason that a cop was held somewhat accountable to that particular shooting. Right. I believe that the police shooting at Fruitvale Station would have been unremarkable in history, probably forgotten about, just like any other police shooting, just one of the 1,000 per year, roughly. It would have been forgotten about in history had it not been for someone filming it on a cell phone.
Yeah, the work that you do is so important, man. And I've always wanted to ask you this: what is it about activism? And why were you drawn to pursue this career in filming it and kind of navigating this world?
Yeah, I think that the problem that I've had with mainstream media is that it's so focused on echoing like voices within government about all issues. Like if there's some issue of the day, right? Taxes should be higher, taxes should be lower. Guns should be less restricted, more restricted, whatever. The mainstream media has made it really easy to present these things as like simple binaries where they can just call on some congressman and some, official or person on a campaign or whatever. And like, that's kind of how they voice, the opinions that you're supposed to care about. And it's like very, very confined to a very simple binary, a very narrow Overton window of like allowable thought. And to me, activism on the street is the most emblematic of what people feel the most strongly about, right? So like in terms of like the effort that you put in to make a change, voting, while important, is like the least somebody can do because they care about something, right?
Yeah.
Like if you really, really like or dislike Donald Trump, right? We'll just use that as an example, right? Like there's a story that can be told about the number of people in each state who vote for that person, right? And someone can express, yes, I do like that person, or I don't like that person, or what they care about or represent by doing that. But if you really want to if you want to understand what people are thinking, what people care about, the issues of the day, then the people who actually go out on the street, potentially confronting others about what they care about, like that gives you such a clearer picture of the mindset of people. When I film I tend to focus a lot on armed activism, on people who show up with guns to things. And that's not simply because firearms are interesting or that audiences care more about situations when they have them, or even the fact that they're inherently sort of more dangerous situations. It is because for someone to care about something so much, that they show up with an instrument capable of death, like that is in a way the most impassioned anybody can be about anything. Like it is a statement of, this is how far I am willing to take it. Yep. This, and so I care deeply about documenting those sorts of people in a way much more than I do about kind of the canned speeches and so forth that you can get in Congress, right? So I have a congressional press credential, and so I can go into the Capitol and film, press briefings and speeches, committee hearings, and so forth. And I've done some of that sometimes, but to me it is so hollow.
Yeah.
So it's so not informative about really the pulse of where America's at compared to traveling around and really meeting people.
It is. And one of the things I did want to ask is like how the thing, and this is a very interesting point that a lot of very pro, and I'm very pro Second Amendment, but like think tanks are like, we should all have guns, right? Like if you're protesting and you're going to do an event, and the reason being is like you are capable, like you see how many times have you seen footage of tear gas and bullshit, right? In those instances where you're a protester and everyone's armed, the level of respect that the government, the ones that have a monopoly on violence, it's going to be pretty fucking mellow, because like lives are at stake, and you can do just as much harm as they can. And so that, I feel like, lowers the amount of potential saboteurs, agent provocateurs that are able to maybe hijack your movement. And I think that that's why a lot of these people may end up doing that. That's my opinion, right? I mean, if something does go wrong and you can't account for everyone that's in your organization or that is protesting with you to do the right thing and have gun responsibility and whatnot. But to me, it does seem like the most dangerous / foolproof plan of not getting fucked with, because and I don't know where your thoughts lie on that. I don't know if you've been at these things where things turned sideways.
Sure. So as a general comment, I have been I don't want to opine on my own political position on guns or something like that, but I can describe from history like my the situations I've been at where guns are involved. So I guess I've been at 4 events with gunfire, other than things like at a range or something like that. I mean, I've certainly filmed guns being fired in controlled settings, but in terms of like at demonstrations where there were gunfire, right? The first was Charlottesville. There was a guy named Richard Preston who it turned out was a janitor at a Baltimore public school, and he was also the leader of his local Klan chapter.
Oh, glorious.
And so during the violence that happened at Charlottesville, I actually filmed basically over his shoulder as people were throwing water bottles up toward at the right-wing side, and he actually unholstered a handgun and pointed it twice at the crowd. And he didn't fire it right then, but I remember feeling like my heart was really pounding, like, oh my God, like the dangerousness of that moment was, immense. later in that day, I actually found out, actually minutes later, he witnessed as there was a right-winger being pushed by the police. The way that day in Charlottesville sort of went was after an unlawful assembly was declared, the police basically pushed everyone the same direction to make them leave. This essentially pushed the right toward the left, which exacerbated the violence rather than ending it, as opposed to, obviously, police ideally push two sides apart in order to alleviate violence. So there was a right-winger being pushed toward somebody on the left, who that person on the left made a makeshift flamethrower. He took a lighter and a spray bottle and basically sprayed flame toward a right-winger. Richard Preston, who I had filmed minutes earlier pointing a gun at the crowd, approached that person and fired a single shot that barely missed him. My understanding is he ultimately was sentenced to 8 years with 4 of them suspended. He may be out by now, probably roughly right now. But so that was one time. And later in that situation, there were a lot of guns at Charlottesville. There was one shot fired. Of course, as we know, later that day, a car was used as a weapon, which led to 19 injuries and 1 death. Yeah. Fast forward to July of 2020, and I was filming the NFAC, the Not Fucking Around Coalition, was a explicitly black nationalist group. Their core ideology was they wanted to take Texas and turn that into a black-only nation.
Nice. These people are okay.
Their leader is now doing 7.5 years in prison for pointing a rifle at a federal agent. But on that day in July, it was actually the first of several times that I filmed them. There was one individual who had a shotgun that apparently passed out. This is how they said it happened, sort of in front of me, but like 100 feet away. So it was like too far to see. They were in a group, and so it was hard to see exactly what led to it. But as everybody was sort of getting ready, there was just this big boom, and smoke rose from the center of it. And at first they thought they were being shot at or something. Like some of them pointed guns like into the crowd, which could have made it like way worse.
Yeah, man.
But it turned out 3 people were hit below the waist by one shotgun fire. To people who aren't familiar, birdshot or buckshot out of a shotgun spreads, and so it can actually hit multiple targets. And so 3 people were injured. The same group rallied in Lafayette, Louisiana in October 2020, and one person who showed up who wasn't part of their group accidentally fired a pistol twice. Nobody was injured that time. And then the last time, the most recent time that I've been in a situation with gunfire was January 6th, Ashley Babbitt being shot. Yeah. And that was a fatal police shooting.
How close were you to that?
Okay, so I did not enter the Capitol. I stood on, for the most part, I stood at the east entrance, which in terms of the dynamics of the day was most relevant in that was where the Oath Keepers breached. So I did not physically go inside the building. Of course, Ashley Babbitt was shot climbing through a broken window into the speaker's lobby, which would have brought her into the House of Representatives, where there were still members of Congress. Following the shooting, the way that I discovered the shooting was that there was an individual who actually came outside. People were just flowing in and out of the building like mad. And so there was an individual who came outside who I interviewed who said to me into my camera that now someone's been shot and she's dead and the blood is on your hands, Mike Pence, was what he told me. And I was like, wait, what? And he confirmed to me that, yeah, a woman was shot with a service weapon. And he said right through the neck. And at the time, I actually didn't believe him. When he said that, I thought not that he was lying, but that there's a lot of things in riot scenarios that can sound like gunfire to the untrained ear. Yeah. Right? Like flash grenades, people, pointing firearms, and then you hear some other boom. It would be very easy to mistake something for gunfire. It wasn't until much later that I realized that he had actually told me the truth, that a woman had actually been shot.
I saw it. I saw the video, man.
I just described the 4 situations that I guess I've been at with gunfire in 5 years. And I've been at a lot more situations that have guns that obviously that they have not been fired. Yeah. My overall impression, I guess I would say, is like the injuries that result from gunfire are drastically more catastrophic than the injuries that result from someone hitting someone with a bat or mace or whatever. There was actually one situation August 2020 in which there was fighting near the Stone Mountain Memorial, which is sort of like the memorial. People call it the Mount Rushmore of the Confederacy. There was brawling involving pepper spray, melee weapons, and so forth, and a lot of people with guns. And something that I realized there that was very interesting to me was when those brawls began and someone with a gun was in it, pretty much every time the people with the guns would run away. They would try to get out of the fight.
Yes, yes.
So there's a deterrent value to firearms, and I've seen like both that be de-escalatory in a way, and that people are less likely to confront an armed rival. And there's also a sense probably of greater responsibility. Like someone with a gun is more likely to retreat from a fight if the fight has actually started. But there's an added tension, and there's an added risk that the violence could be fatal if it's added. Like it really raises the risk level, while also decreasing in a way the likelihood of violence happening in the first place. And so I guess I would say that like the result is quite mixed.
It is
in my experience.
And if we lived in a world full of Ricks, Fischer, Fords, and Johns. We'd be fine, because the proper thing to do if you're carrying is to immediately de-escalate. It's like the guy pulling his gun, the janitor, the Klansman janitor pulling his gun, right? Like, you'd never do that unless your intent is to end. Oh my goodness, it's a beagle. Yes. Ford has brought the beagle.
He's been napping the whole time, and then he just walked over to me as if to say, like, I'm getting bored of this podcasting.
But yeah.
So there's Chestnut.
They're Chestnut, the beagle. I love it. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
But your primary, you got to de-escalate, right? And that's what I'm saying. It would be, I don't know if I would go if there was a bunch of guns, because I just can't count on other people. There's a thing called gun balls, and a lot of people have them, and that essentially means you're looking for trouble and you want to kill someone, and I don't want to be a part of that. But listen, man, I want to be respectful of your time. Tell the good people where they can find you, and you've already shared with us where you're heading next, but just let them know where they can find you on social media and all that good jazz.
So it's News2Share, News2Share on Facebook. It's at N2S Reports on Twitter, and then my personal account is at Ford Fischer, FORD FISCHER, and on YouTube also News2Share. And sometimes on Twitter I also post stuff with Chestnut, so if you follow me there, then you might also see him.
All right, man. Well, I appreciate it. Folks, the world is a crazy place, but again, you got to focus on what you control, your diet, your effort, and your attitude, and that's all you can do. I love you guys, and we'll see you next week.